let's finish up chapter 7, shall we? And module 5. So this is lecture 5C. So once again, we're only doing one chapter this week because of the Pure Scholar activity. And so this is the end now of chapter 7. So let's go do it. We're going to be focusing here on Carl Jung. Excuse me. All right. Let's jump right into it. Carl Jung. I like these sketches sometimes. I don't know why. They look more fun to me than the actual pictures of people. Carl Jung is known for a number of things, and we're going to touch on some of them today. Here's the first one, and the textbook tells a little bit about this story that, you know, we've talked about this in the last lecture, that for Freud, it all started, or a lot of it started with sexual energy, sexual and aggressive, but it was the sexual energy stuff that was so shocking to so many people, and quite honestly, it was the reason why a big part of the reason why everybody became interested in Freud. That, plus he's a fascinating writer. I do recommend that you read some of Freud's stuff. You'll find it really interesting. He's a good writer. He was also a very controversial figure in general. So as one other little factoid about Freud, he wrote a number of papers espousing the virtues of cocaine. He was quite a fan of cocaine. Of course, it was not an illicit narcotic at the time. It was a new drug that had just sort of been discovered, and Freud found that you could do all sorts of things and be all very energetic with cocaine, accomplish a bunch of stuff, and he thought it was great. So yeah, talked about sex a lot, did a lot of coke, and wrote really well. 3 of the reasons why Freud became well known. But also, that whole theory of and the whole notion of there being this sort of psychological drama or tension or something underneath, and there's energy that needs to be released, was a cool theory. And we've already talked about how other people have said, okay, yeah, but I don't think it's sexual energy. I think it's all about power. That was Adler, and then we had Horney say, no, I think it's more about social relationships. That's what matters. Well, Carl Jung was in this sort of game too. Maybe he was in the game first, actually, and he was talking about psychic energy. So he was a friend of Freud for a long time, a colleague, a contemporary, a fellow psychoanalyst. Freud at one point thought Carl Jung was going to be his successor. The sort of new head of psychoanalysis, until Carl did this. This was betrayal to Freud. To Freud, the theory that he proposed was psychoanalysis, and you couldn't change it, especially if you were watering it down. And that's what Freud thought Jung was doing. Freud thought, oh, you're getting the sexuality out of that because some people are uncomfortable with that. And so you found this, and it is a sort of vague term, psychic energy. There is this energy, but it's not necessarily from sexual issues and such as Freud talked about. And so as Jung would present it that way, a lot of people preferred that way. Jung's way of talking about it. They liked the lack of sexual energy. So it became, also popular in a different way. So it's kind of like Freud became popular because of the sexual stuff. But then at some point people are like, okay, that was crazy, it was interesting, but is that a scientific theory really? And they started to prefer things that didn't emphasize the sexuality component so much. So when Jung was doing this, he actually had a big fallout with Freud over this issue, and it was eventually essentially disowned by Freud as somebody doing something that Freud did not consider psychoanalysis anymore. Some of the other things he's known for, by the way, even before I do this, because I don't think I have it on the list, he's very known for that free association kind of task that I told you about earlier. What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say X, Y, or Z? And Carl Jung especially was interested in the time it took people to respond to these, and he was interested in the ones where they were a little slow. He thought that reflected, that's how you could get at an issue related to the psychological energy. So he's known for that. He also was the one that originally proposed this distinction between introverts and extroverts. Extroverts being very interested in the world outside them and very participatory in the world outside them. They were out there doing stuff, and that's where their focus was. Introverts focused much more internally. in the internal world, less about the external world, and so less likely to be out there partying and doing stuff, more likely to be living a sort of quiet, introverted kind of life. These are now things we just use and assume everybody knows what they are. But before Jung, people didn't really know about this distinction or think about this distinction. He's the one that really kind of fleshed that out. And that's beginning, those of you who know personality theory, this is part of what we now consider the big five, the 5 different characteristics upon which people's personality may differ. And this is a core one that's part of the big 5. So that was Jung. We're going to talk about some of these things as we go along, but he thought there was 2 kinds of unconscious. There was the kind Freud spoke of, and that was the personal unconscious. So things in your unconscious that got there through your life, through the duration of your life. And so that's the personal unconscious. But he also thought there was this other layer. And so this is where Carl Jung starts to get a little mystical, sort of, in a way. It's going to be a little like that notion of innate knowledge that we started with, but a little different as well. It's kind of like Carl Jung thought we were all connected to one knowledge base that's called the collective unconscious. And it's unconscious. We can't just see it. We can't just go there, but it's back there somewhere, and it affects us all. And it's like somehow everything all of us experience forms this sort of collective unconscious that's sitting in the shadows somewhere, but is there and is real. So it's a kind of mystical world, this collective unconscious. But you'll sometimes see people pointing to it now, and he thought that was a distinct, different kind of thing than the personal unconscious, which was only about your lived experiences, whereas the collective was like everybody's, somehow going into some pool. There's a few things about Jung that make you go, what exactly does he mean? And it's not always so easy, but I'll try my best. The other thing he was really known for was this concept of archetypes. Archetypes are part of the collective unconsciousness. They are themes, they are characters, they are so hard to put words to some of these Jungian concepts. The one they talk about a lot in the textbook is the concept of a hero. They will say things like, if you watch movies, well, even before movies, let's go before movies. Let's say you're an anthropologist and you started visiting different groups of peoples who were cut off from the rest of the world, and you looked at the stories they told. There would be certain themes that would always reemerge. And so, for example, the concept of hero, there might often be somebody in these stories who steps up and does good and helps others and is viewed by others in this kind of way, right? What we all think of as a hero. We're now saying our healthcare workers are our heroes, right? And so his concept was, every culture, even those cut off from everybody else, kind of knows that concept of a hero, and they know the concept of a villain, and they know the concept of, and so he started to try to think of how many archetypes there are, and it's, in his view, it is a limited set. There are only so many archetypes, but it might be a very big set. So we might have, the lover is another archetype that shows him somebody who's, the lover. I don't know. Just kind of that's their sort of attribute, or that's the character they kind of play. And so Jung thought these archetypes emerged from our collective unconscious. The fact that we all kind of draw on these same common themes, to him said, well, these themes live in the back of all of our unconscious, and we share these themes. That's the sort of collective unconscious. Okay, so let's work through some of that a little bit more and see if we can get there. So let's do this representation and kind of connect it to some of the things we were talking about. So first of all, just to make sure you understand, we have this line between A and A prime here, this line, that's supposed to be the threshold of consciousness. The space over here, D, is what we're conscious of. C is the unconscious, including the collective unconscious somewhere back here. B is the real world. Okay, so the idea is we're interacting with the real world, and we're usually aware of the stuff that's coming in from the real world, although I don't know if he would say we're exclusively. I suspect he would say some things could get to B to C without going through D. That is, that the external world can affect our unconscious without us being conscious of that effect. Yeah. But anyway, you have the sense, real world, stuff we're conscious of, unconscious, and this is the sort of line of consciousness. Okay, so D is what you're consciousness of, the ectopsychic world. By the way, those Ghostbusters fans who like ectoplasm, you have people like Jung to celebrate, I guess, for using the words external to you, and so yeah, that is the external world. But C is the shadow world. This is where Jung had a lot of fun, and this is where he really distinguishes himself a little bit. So he says things like the following: there the ego is somewhat dark. We do not see into it. It's into our unconscious, right? So there's parts of us we know about, but there's also parts down here that we don't know about. So we cannot see into it. We are an enigma to ourselves. We only know the ego. He's kind of using ego like the self, I guess, in D. We do not know it in C. Therefore, we are always discovering something new about ourselves. Almost every year, something new turns up that we did not know before. We always think we are now at the end of our discoveries. We never are. We go on discovering we are this, that, and other things, and sometimes we have astounding experiences. This is kind of how Freud and Jung wrote. They wrote in a kind of fun, interesting way. But yeah, that gives you, a little of a sense of the world. And so part of C might be things about yourself you just don't know that have been developed by your lived experiences. But part of C is also this collective unconscious where the archetypes live. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I did that justice, but I'm gonna move on. It's hard to do Jung justice. I'll say that. We'll try to get you a little closer to the archetypes. So let's go through this a little bit. It's difficult to say how many archetypes there are, although Jungians argue that the number is finite and corresponds to our most fundamental experiences incurred since primordial times. They are the same in all cultures. We find them reoccurring in all mythologies, fairy tales, religious traditions, and mysteries. Just recurring themes and character traits, etc. So among the archetypes most frequently discussed in the Jungian literature are the anima and the animus. The anima is the masculine, so these are a little hard on the head, so go with this. The anima is the masculine image of femininity, while the animus is the feminine image of masculinity. So each of us has a mask or a persona that constitutes our public self. So this is who we are, who we choose to show ourselves to others. To the extent we identify with this mask, we will be cut off from those parts of ourselves that are inconsistent with it. So let's say it's important to me to be a manly man. I don't think that fits me very well. Let's pick Donald Trump again. It is certainly important to Donald Trump that he exudes masculinity, right? He wants to be the strong, tough man, all right? So that's what he exudes to everybody else. And I mean, this is kind of an interesting line, to the extent we identify with this mask. So is that also who we're telling ourselves we are? Or are we kind of explicitly fooling everybody? If it's a fake mask, if we know that's not really who we are, but we're just showing that to others, then the following may not be true. But if we really start to believe that ourselves, if we say, yes, that's who we are, then we will be cut off from those parts of ourselves that are inconsistent with it. So someone whose persona is excessively masculine may be totally unaware of his or her feminine side, which is represented by the anima. While someone who's excessively feminine, what are we thinking, Marilyn Monroe, or what's a modern Marilyn Monroe? Yeah, I'll come back to that. Anyway, is totally aware of the masculine side. So what you often hear nowadays, for example, is girl power, right? You'll hear girl power quite a bit. You'll see the Beyoncés or something like that, who are admittedly very feminine and yet strong, powerful, right? And so there's a big pride from the female side about being that kind of strong woman. I think the first person like that, by the way, was Joan Jett. If you don't know Joan Jett, go listen to Bad Reputation. One of the songs she wrote, she's a rock and roller at a time when people said women don't rock and roll. Women aren't rock and rollers. She said, oh yeah, I'll show you. And she rocks better than any man ever has. But she's a masculine. She brings her masculine side out. And so that's kind of cool on the woman's side. Is it cool on the man's side? Sort of. I think a lot of men try to show that they're sensitive, that they're caring, that they have an emotional side, unlike, say, a Trump, who clearly is not trying to show any of that. But if you look at some of the American politics, especially right now, especially around all this racial issues that are happening, you see Joe Biden being more feminine. It's not really feminine, but emotional, empathetic, connecting with the victims, which we think of that emotional side as the more feminine side. And so he's quite happily saying, I'm not that blowhard, big guy. I'm this other caring, nurturing, loving individual who really, has other people's happiness and success in mind. And so he's wearing that a little bit more. Okay, so I mean, you get the idea. These are just these concepts, these archetypes that are out there, and yeah, I mean, yeah. I always feel like I want to say something better about this, but I can never. You hear me struggling to try to find the words to make it more clear. It's a bit of an abstract concept, but as you get familiar with it, you start to see this come up. So like Satan would be another archetype, where in a lot of cultures or religions there's an ultimate evil being that's trying to make you do wrong. And so we can say Satan, but you could also, if you look at Pinocchio, there are these little characters in Pinocchio that keep tempting Pinocchio to do things he shouldn't be doing and getting him in trouble. So again, that's kind of that satanic archetype coming through. I'm going to leave it there, but I hope you get a sense of the archetypes there. Jung was also big on this binary theory thing we've talked about, putting things on binary sides of a continuum like this. And so, for example, he said people could be kind of thought of as lying somewhere along this dimension. So people that are more about thinking and people that are more about feeling. So I've said to you before, and I say this to reporters all the time, that human beings are part rational and part emotional, and the emotional part is very strong. And sometimes when you see, well, we've had Trump throwing around here, so let me throw him around one more time. People will say, how did he ever get elected? Why don't people see that he's continually lying and he's continual whatever? Well, that's because the people that vote for Trump aren't doing so because they're thinking things through. They're doing it because he connects with them on an emotional level. He's strong, he's powerful, they like that strength, they like that power, it makes them feel stronger and more powerful, and they vote to them. And the people that are doing all this rationalization, saying, I don't know what they're thinking, they're not thinking. They're not voting based on their frontal lobes. They're voting based on their reticular formation or something, something much more midbrain, something much more emotional related. So he would say people can fall on this continuum. How much do they do things because of thought versus feeling? I would probably be pretty high over here quite a bit of the time. And how much are they focused on actual believing things they see? How much is it what they see and hear that dominates how they come to believe things, and how much is it based on just sort of what seems right to them, intuition? And so some people are willing to go with intuition, a sort of internal thing. Yeah, it feels right. Other people are like, no, I have to see it with my own eyes to believe it. That's a sensation thing. Bigger point being, he just started talking about people. He had introversion, extroversion already, right? And now he's talking about some of these other dynamics that we could put a person's personality on. So he is simultaneously starting to empower this personality, this theory of personality, and that part of psychology. And he's also using dichotomies to do it. So those of you who know the Big Five personality index, those are 5 lines like this. Introversion, extroversion being one of them. But the idea is there's 5 of these that you can see a person's personality lying at some point along. And Jung really kind of helped that thinking along. I think that's my Jung for now. No, it's not. It's not. I forgot about this one. The other cool characteristic of Jung, and the reason a lot of people are drawn to him, is because he was, I guess you'd say, a scientist. I don't know. He's a psychologist, at least, maybe theoretical psychologist. Yeah. But he was also interested in things like parapsychology, sort of weird, what we would now consider non-scientific sort of notions, now sort of spiritual notions. At the time when Jung was doing his thing, this spiritual thing was everywhere. People were having seances all the time. They were trying to connect with dead people. They thought ghosts were real and manipulating things in the real world. This was just the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. This is what a lot of people believed in. And Jung was there as well. And the greatest example that Jung makes a big deal out of is synchronicity. There were times when he thought things came together that were not coincidence. They actually were signaling something, some sort of connection between what's happening now and some bigger thing. The example they give in the textbook is, he was talking to a patient. I may not have this quite right, but I have it roughly right. And maybe the patient was talking about a dream, I think, and she mentioned that she had picked up the scarab beetle, or there was a scarab beetle in her dream. And as she was talking about this, Jung heard a sort of tapping on the window. And when he looked over, it was a bug trying to get in. And he opened the window and grabbed the bug, I guess he's fast, looked at the bug, and it was the closest thing you could have to a scarab beetle where he lived. And so he thought, this is not a coincidence. Her talking about a scarab beetle and then one just showing up, that is what he called synchronicity. And he thought some bigger thing was at play there. And he was always on the lookout for synchronicities. So that's one taste of Jung and mysticism. That's why a lot of people are fascinated by Jung, because we're all fascinated by mysticism stuff, right? And so the fact that someone who's a big thinker and an academic thinker would be open to all of this was kind of cool. Okay, so now final words. I've hinted at this all through, but I just want to be explicit about this at the end. Why is Freud generally not appreciated by psychologists? There's a range of reasons, but there's one that really counts more than any, and it's the one I kind of highlighted when we were talking about, what if you replace sexuality with power, or what if you replaced it with social connections, etc., or psychic, whatever. In order for any theory to have any relevance to a scientist, it has to make testable predictions. If a theory can explain any outcome, then it's impossible to ever falsify that theory. And so scientists don't like Freud for the same reason they don't like the Bible and the Quran and any other religious book you can imagine. It's not because those things are wrong. So the scientists are not saying Freud is wrong. It is because those things are untestable. If you're a Christian who believes in an all-powerful God that can move the world in mysterious ways, then there is nothing that can happen on this planet that you can't explain with that notion. And sometimes the explanation you give is, well, we're just humans. You can never understand what the intent is. So why does God allow a virus that kills hundreds of thousands of people? Well, God has a reason, and we're just mere mortals, so we can never understand. So we can explain, suffering and stuff at that level. If you can explain any outcome with your story, then it is just a story. It's not a theory. Theories have to lead to testable predictions. So yes, Freud took psychology in this different direction, and he included all the sexuality and stuff that kind of messed up some people's minds. But the scientists really didn't like Freud because they didn't think anything he was doing was testable. And that was magnified by the fact that Freud himself didn't feel there to be any need to test. He wasn't a scientist. He felt like, hey, I'm helping my patients. That's all that matters to me. I don't have to prove myself to anybody. And so early therapists followed sort of Freud's lead, and they kind of shunned the scientific method, and they said, doesn't matter, it's not our game, man. And So that really kind of bothered a lot of the scientists as well, and they reacted to that. And as we see the development of psychology, part of what you're going to see in upcoming chapters is how different psychologists in different parts of the world reacted to Freud, and changed the way they do psychology as a result. So that will be the continuing story next week. See you later, guys.